There's a lot more to say about Dr. Carruthers. Lots of us call her Mama Carruthers because she has that kind of spirit. She is, despite all of her accolades and honors that she's gotten, she takes the time to nurture us who are still on the journey.
Yes, she does.
And we thank you for that.
Amen.
So I give you Dr. Iva Carruthers, who I know is going to inspire, so sit up straight, pay attention. Because Mama's in the house, she has something to say, and it is extremely important.
Good morning. Good morning. I love you all. This is such a wonderful spirit in this place. Dr. Hema, thank you so much. Yes. As I take the mantle from you, I want to add to her words that we also must figure out how to dismantle the evil without becoming that very evil. And so we thank you for grounding us and centering us for a time such as this, because the time is urgent. I am going to be sensitive to and trying to honor the time that I have been given. I know that I've probably written more on this page than I will be able to say, so we just have to flow with it as the God that I serve uses me and stands with me, I know. I want to say hi to all y'all, my family, my friends, my fellow journey, persons who I've had the privilege of sharing my time with. This is very special for me because as you labor in the field, you need to be able to come back to, like a honing pigeon, a place where you know you are with kindred spirits. And so I don't take this moment lightly at all. I know that there are questions we all wake up with every morning seeking to ask, and they're increasingly more penetrating as we say, God, why? You know? How long?
Yeah.
Help us to understand the mystery of the way in which you work. As General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, as a founding visionary of that organization, I am privileged to travel the world to represent a voice for justice with a firm belief that there is a sovereign creator and a creation that we have become stewards of. I do that with a sense that I'm on an umbilical cord with that spirit, and that I have to speak. I have to use my voice. It was so wonderful to hear the drums from the American Indian Center. I am an honorary Navajo, as a matter of fact. And when I was at the university as chairperson, I reached out and did a lot of work with the American Indian Center. And I sat here and I thought about in the last 15 months where I have been, and my footsteps have taken me to India, to South Africa, to Japan, to Thailand, to Switzerland, and to Belize, and if the Lord is willing, Palestine is on my schedule for the next few months. And so when I think about those times of sharing with kindred spirits like you, I know that we are struggling with this issue of reckoning and reclamation, of a different way forward, of a way that is in more synergy with the spirit of the Holy One. And so I stand here in the spirit of Namaste and Ubuntu, saying I am because we are. By way of disclosure, I think it's important that I tell you a little bit about who I am, unapologetically. I am an African-American woman. I grew up during the separate but equal period, as they call it, but we know it was a separate but unequal period. It was the northern style of Jim Crow, up the road a bit in Evanston, Illinois, segregated system. But I was born into a family who carried the mantle of leadership and dared to believe that we deserve to be able to walk on this earth with the fullest expression of our humanity. I have traveled the African world. I have been in hamlets and on land and places and spaces where we have to ask the question, Lord, are you here? God, do you hear the cries of these people who were born in your image and are equally endowed with the full humanity and human dignity that we all deserve. I am also unapologetically Christian. I'm raised as a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and I joined the United Church of Christ. I've worked in the academy and as an entrepreneur. I accepted my call to ministry in a full-time way that has afforded me the opportunity to work in interfaith context and ecumenical context, and most of all, intercultural context. I have learned both in spirit and in flesh to understand that there is divinity within all, and that the power of the unseen as a source of resiliency and hope and agency for change exists all over the world. And thirdly, like you, I just don't think any of us would be here today if we didn't have an impulse for compassionate care of creation and other human beings. We have committed our lives to the helping professions. We're nurses, we're doctors, we're social workers, we're people of faith. And we are agitated by the degree of narcissism and systemic evil in our midst. In fact, we unconsciously and consciously are seeking answers to how to stand at the intersection of being wounded healers and wounded warriors. Maladon Patrice Somé in The Healing Wisdom of Africa lifts up the saying of the Dagara peoples who declare that a man who can't cry as a social time bomb. A man who cannot cry is a social time bomb. He notes that to grieve is a ritual act of cleansing to purify the psychic. It is necessary for individuals and communities to grieve. I commit to you to read some of that, but I'll read a little bit more about what he says in quotations. That a ritual of grieving, the sacred shedding of tears to heal the wounds of human losses. To shed tears is to release an energy that otherwise will poison the self. Wow. Ritual, community, and healing are intertwined. So I want to suggest that if we are serious about this issue of dealing with trauma, we must first acknowledge that we in this room are unconsciously wounded ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. We in this room must submit to the reality that we serve concomitantly in this world as wounded healers and wounded warriors. We are wounded by the repeated witnessing of the consequences of trauma and pain experienced by those we serve and seek to help heal. We are wounded by the related institutional systemic forces that get in the way in our theoretical training and our just plain old common sense. And as African Americans in the United States, we are wounded healers in particular because we have never had the luxury or time or affirmation of our humanity sufficient to appropriately grieve from generation to generation. Wounded warriors because the external forces of destruction are ever more present with intentional, systemic, and global tentacles of mental, physical, and genomic annihilation of African peoples and the taking of our lands. The operative word I don't want you to miss is wounded. So as wounded healers and warriors, we must dare to ask the foundational question of what trauma, whose trauma, and why trauma. If we are honest with ourselves, we should conclude that America is the quintessential bedrock of collective and communal trauma. And for sure, African American peoples are unquestionably all living in a state of conscious and unconscious trauma. As Anwar, the novelist in 2000 Season, warns that people must accept the responsibility to redress the state of our individual and collective business and being, and the cause as a way out. He says, if not all of you, your children, and their children after them from generations after them again and again, all will be victims till the way is found again. till the return of our way, the way. The way, the North Star, the way is Namaste, the way is Ubuntu. And so in light of the transgenerational, undeserved, and atrocious executions of Black people, whether lynching or police executions, the presentation of that in the pop culture and the media, the display of racialized power, whether at a Klan gathering or on the steps of the Virginia Capitol, as object of public policy or presidential characterizations. African American people are under a constant cloud of communal trauma to which I can testify. Indeed, as a result of being and living Black in America in a crucible characterized by racialized demonization and murder, the loss of peers all too soon, our young people, they are consciously and subconsciously, spoken and unspoken, short and long term, experiencing intergenerational consequences that we must address. The Association of Black Psychologists refer to all of this as both historical trauma and political terrorism. In 2 weeks, I will host 1,000 faith leaders in D.C. at our 17th annual convening. We will gather under the theme, ironically, Decade of Destiny, engaging the powers. We gather at the turn of a new decade when the nation's epicenter finds itself at the nadir, the lowest point of national political corruption, abandonment of democratic ideals, and the total disdain for a vision of a compassionate, beloved community. In other words, this congregation that we are this morning is looked upon with disdain, because we in this room represent a new way forward. From my lens, the truth is this decade of destiny is being ushered in under an unabashed agenda that represents a quintessential case study of the causes and impacts of individual, community, and systemic trauma. Indeed, we must confront the evil and the sources of individual and collective trauma before us. And as the theme of this gathering conveys, this is an urgent and determinant moment. The foundational true narrative of this system is that it was founded on Native American genocide and African enslavement, yielding benefit and domination, hegemony to white males in particular as individuals, their families and communities. And the systems they run are now fighting for their very survival. The fight is against principles of compassionate, inclusive, and just communities as a North Star for what it means to be human and to live in a diverse community. The 2020 Florida legislation is no different than the 3/5 clause. If you don't know what I'm talking about is 1.3, 1.5 million formerly incarcerated persons were given the right back to vote in the state of Florida, and to circumvent that, in the last week, there has been a case being argued by a colleague who will join us in D.C. because the legislation has said they will only be allowed to vote if they pay back the state for the money spent during their incarceration. This is no different than Thomas Jefferson's pronouncement about the 3 races of mankind upon the American soil, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and the New York Caucasian newspaper model of the 1860s, in which it said, quote, "I hold that this government was made on the white basis by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." And that is what is happening right now as we debate in the U.S. Senate. There are 3 grounding assumptions that I want to offer to you this morning for moral consideration and the use of the agency of faith communities. I am submitting that we are in a period of deep national and global confusion, destabilizing and confounding principles of human rights. This period is manifesting the prophetic witness of Dr. Martin Luther King's declaration that this nation was being gobbled up by the 3 isms of militarism, materialism, and racism. We might call that the triumphant axis of evil, if you will. The second point I want to make is that the culminated racialized hatred of people of color has been undergirded by sociological and theological justifications and has in fact generated new norms of justifying living with and coping with racialized trauma. The racialized trauma is built around a theory of a hierarchy of human value and Afrophobia. Further, I ask you to consider that this new norm is a manifestation of a process of what psychologists and marketing experts call simulacra and psychological dissonance, to the extent that we have begun to believe the fake. The real is the fake, and the fake is the real. And I think that's very important for us this morning, because I'm submitting to you that we celebrate resiliency in ways that are not healthy, because we are masking destructive adaptation to evil and trauma. The victims are unhealthy with negative self-identities. The beneficiaries of hierarchy of human value and Afrophobia are confused and confounded and diseased by a false sense of superiority that is treacherous. And this is what leads us to the urgency of now, because we have now entered into a period in which epigenetics has ushered in evidence that certainly the consequences, and I would argue the causes, whatever they are, have evidenced transgenerational transmission of trauma. So you hopefully understand the emergent significance of the science of epigenetics, which is bolstering arguments that document the often latent long-term consequences and drama and damage that traumatic events inflict upon people and communities. To be sure, while most of the research in this area has largely been based in studies concerning veterans and Holocaust victims, the implications for 400 years of transgenerational racialized traumatic experiences of people of African descent cannot be denied. And so I raised questions in some contexts, like when I was speaking at the Bioethics Center in Tuskegee, about what does that import in terms of what it means to be carrying in your wombs multiple generations of trauma that was experienced by the transatlantic slave trade. I don't really have time to go into that, but let me just say that for me, the facts of mass incarceration, wedded to neo-eugenics, using genetic understandings about the possibility of envisioning a different kind of society, and biogenetics, which is now grounded in global systems of power, say to me that this is a decade requiring grave vigilance by ethicists and people of color and people of goodwill all over the world. And so if you go now to the research, you will find, for example, that China is probably leading in this research around biogenetics and cellular manipulation in relationship to what it means to be human. The bottom line is that cutting-edge epigenetics is informing our understanding of the role of trauma, of memory, and healing. So the question for me today is, in whose hands is our ethical future in the midst of evidence-based research on a historical racialized hierarchy of human value and Afrophobia, ongoing sociological and theological justifications for this kind of oppression and containment of people of color, and a downward spiral and abandonment of an ethical center that values democracy, human dignity for all. In short, how do we in this room begin to identify and dismantle the consequences of the trauma, the internal and external trauma, as victim and as beneficiaries of this new autocratic iteration of a hierarchy of human value, that some of us are more valuable than others of us? It is here that I turn to address the intersection of trauma, faith, and resiliency, the role and capacity of communities of faith to address the situational and protracted trauma under which we live. Faith communities, diverse as they may be, are the umbilical cord to a people's sense of the divine, their relationship to Creator and creation. Faith communities are places and spaces where people gather and declare and engage in sacred ritual as expressions of hope and healing. The role of faith communities in the midst of despair and trauma is to be a refuge, a center of healing for the wounded, and agents of dismantling institutional systems of evil and oppression. The capacity of faith communities to carry out these roles is limited only by their knowledge or lack thereof, their commitment and courage to confront evil, and a willingness to engage in collaborative coalition building and mobilization. For together, as the African proverb says, the ants ate the elephants. In the midst of success and failure, celebration and trauma, Jesse Jackson declares that the dream of a new day and a new way. Go forward by hope and never backward by fear. And in the end, faith will not disappoint. Keep faith alive. Keep hope alive. In the darkest hours of apartheid, Bishop Tutu and Alan Buzak and other faith leaders kept alive the light of hope and resilience in South Africa. And today, though that light is very dim for marginalized people all over the world, in India and Iraq and Palestine, and yes, in the hamlets of Virginia who are encircled by armed militia, it is the role of faith communities to appropriate whatever capacity they have to keep hope alive. For in those moments, new resilience and resistance is born. And this brings me to the question I was asked to address. What individual and collective healing strategies might faith communities employ to address individual, communal, and systemic evil and trauma? What can we do and where do we go from here? There are a myriad of answers, but I will give you some ideas from my strategic bucket. I have three. One is, to Armoir's point, we must seek the way of righteousness. That means redefining, reclaiming our North Star. What is our destination? Where are we going? How do we envision righteousness as a goal towards the building of just communities that affirm the humanity of all who live in them? Secondly, I'm suggesting we must be guided by the power of remembrance. In the spirit of Sankofa, going back to fetch it, we must find our way back through a transformative revolution of values to create another way forward. A way that honors the past traumas, that seeks to right the wrongs, and pledges to not repeat the transgressions and violations of basic human rights. And what I have just defined is the third bucket. We must deal deep to find ways to engage the powers in the demand for reparatory justice and reparations. And we must do that without apology. Reparations as a pathway to healing and healed communities, the right of righteousness. It is not about money. In the end, it is about reparatory healing. And you certainly cannot affect real justice and equity without reparations, without making right those things which are wrong, without coming to moments of reckoning and pledge non-repeat of transgression. And you certainly cannot restore what never was. So therefore, we must interrogate critically the notions of restorative justice. For one cannot restore back to what never was. This is what Martin Luther King referred to when he spoke of reparations for unpaid labor of people of African descent. He did more than say, I have a dream. He talked about reparations, as well as the argument that what was needed was a revolution of values, not reform in public policy. Now, I must admit that I sometimes wonder to what extent we need to see those of us who have adapted to trauma as the ones in the most need of healing, as opposed to those we often treat in need of healing from trauma. I say that in jest, and for real, you go figure. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we say the people who are crazy, they may be more sane than us, because we have adapted to the trauma. So as wounded healers, there are three basic research-based constructs which I have found informative and relevant for faith leaders to respond to the moral imperative of this moment in history, this urgent moment in history. One is post-traumatic stress syndrome. The other is the concept of community violence. And the third is moral injury.
Yes.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, I know that I'm assuming most in this room, if not all, are very familiar with and understand that that emerged in large part out of the consequences of witnessing what was happening with returning Vietnam War veterans. What has happened fast forward is that that has now become a very effective construct for understand the consequences of for trauma, the impact of trauma and intergenerational trauma in particular as it relates to what happens in terms of mental disorders, etc. Again, that speaks though to who is mentally in need of healing and help. The second one is community violence, which is more defined as people experiencing trauma experiences that relate to witnessing the kinds of incidences that are outside the norm of what violates your sense of security, your sense of safety, your sense of what you consider to be normative behavior in the context of what it means to be human and in the expectation of when you come into community, that which will occur and happen. And so we are finding ourselves more and more confronted with having to adapt to the notion that we walk into public spaces and at any moment in time we are victims of some traumatic, violent event. And then moral injury as a psychological trauma that is a construct that describes extreme and unprecedented life experiences, including the aftermath of exposure to such events that are harmful. And the key precondition for moral injury is an act of transgression which shatters our moral and ethical expectations that are rooted in religious or spiritual beliefs or cultural-based organization and group-based rules about fairness, the value of life, and so forth. I personally probably could relate to that in my first personal experience when I was in the waiting room for 18 hours as my father went under for one of the first kidney transplants in this nation at a veterans hospital. And we were told that only 20% of those would survive. At that time, you couldn't even take pain medication when you came out of surgery. It was 18 hours. Nurses were walking around with jars with kidneys saying, oh, we got another one. We knew that those who went, more likely or not, would come back alive. Sitting in the waiting room, here I am, a sociologist. I look, and JAMA's lead article was Aging as a Disease. And so I had to juxtapose, as a daughter, my father's life and my desire that he live with the fact that the society was moving towards an assumption that aging was a disease, and therefore we had to mitigate the aging process. That, to me, was a challenge to my moral and ethical sense of being. So I know that personally. Certainly, we all know that collectively. And so what I say as a wounded healer is that there are deep, deep issues that we can take those three constructs, put them in the context of our faith tradition, our theological understanding, our spiritual understanding and values of belief, and translate that in conversations in ways that I think can help us to individually and collectively move towards a period of healing. As wounded warriors, however, there are three related constructs I want to share with you that I think have great value. Those three are the hierarchy of human value, Afrophobia, and I must put on the table genocide. All three are useful to how courageous faith communities exercise their moral agency for a time such as this. The hierarchy of human value is not new. When you go back and you look at the conversations in philosophy and in history came out of the Western Euro world, you will understand that we right now are living in a notion of a triage context for hierarchy of human value in terms of who gets what when, who has the benefits. That is very much evident. We oftentimes miss it, but I think the Kellogg Foundation must be given credit most recently for having lifted up this hierarchy of human value as the prism through which to address racial equity in this country and indeed the world. And I celebrate the work of the former Vice President Gail Christopher of the Kellogg Foundation for making that argument so powerful in a way that now you have the entire philanthropic community at least having it in front of their face as a way to think about how they fund the process of addressing issues of racism and inequality. But the reality is that DeGavino gave it to us, as did Hegel, which essentially said that the European world, and there is a hierarchy within the European structure, is on top. The Asian world is next, and the African world is at the bottom. And the bottom line quote from Hegel is that we therefore take Egypt out of Africa, which people read the Bible and don't recognize that Egypt is in Africa. We never have to come back to mention Africa again because it has nothing to contribute to world history. And that's why we think the Suez Canal is the dividing point and that there is something called the Middle East, which there is not. Now, the second one I want to suggest we have to deal with is this notion of Afrophobia. And Afrophobia is a construct that has been, in fact, affirmed by both the World Council of Churches and the United Nations as an appropriate way to understand how all of this is playing out towards, 5 minutes, thank you very much, towards how all of this is playing out in the world as it relates to us moving to autocratic societies, whether we're talking about what's going on in Palestine, whether we're talking about what's going on in the borders of the United States, or whether we're talking about what's going on in Europe. So it is a fear of people of African descent or people of color in relationship to the infestation of otherwise pure Euro white communities and cultural hegemony. Are you following me? Okay. So Afrophobia is another construct I think communities of faith need to understand. And thirdly, I would just put on the table that this notion of crime against humanity and genocide is another one we need to understand because we have entered in, and I will submit that, to a period in which you check off the definition of a genocide, if you check off the stages that relate to the historical analysis of what happened in relationship to the Holocaust, you will see the evidence of how we are inching up towards that. You with me?
Yeah.
We are. Please do. So, if you understand that genocide means murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or other inhumane acts, ill treatment or deportation to slave labor, killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm, inflicting on group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. If you look at all those criteria, you apply that to what you are witnessing today in this country and the world. The understanding of the 5 stages towards the Holocaust are identification, ostracism, confiscation, concentration, towards annihilation. Again, look at those stages in terms of what you witnessed. And I would say, therefore, that we can say, as James Waller, who is a scholar expert on the Nazi Holocaust, that cautions us that what they knew was that, and I'm quoting, rank and file killers, the soldiers, the police, the militia, and civilians at the bottom of the hierarchy personally carried out the millions of executions. These people were ordinary people that, with few exceptions, They were readily absorbed into civil society after the killings and peacefully lived out their otherwise unremarkable lives. What he is warning us is that there is a gradual creep and that we all become complicit. So I am going to have to close. So I'm going to default on Christian scripture, Jeremiah 6:14. They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. And so I ask of you, when the people feel like their trauma only serves the empire's causes, the empire's gain, the empire's delight, the empire is callous and determined to maintain their power at any cost. Militarism, materialism, and insatiable greed. We have a setup for anarchy and killings. To get to healing, we must engage the meaning of hope for the other. Resiliency is born in the spirit of hope. One of my colleagues, Dr. Contreras Bird, says, what makes you truly strong is not determined by how much what you do changes things, but rather by the fact that you are determined to always do something. And so I want to submit to you that we are especially vulnerable if we do this work alone or in isolation as Lone Rangers. Through the character of the master healer, Armamar creates a character of the healer, master healer Danforth. And he tells us that healing work is hard. It requires you to take leave of the world you've known. The best choice a healer makes is not a choice against anything. It's a choice for the healing vocation. The healing work that causes and cures a whole people is the highest work, far higher than the cure of single individuals. A healer needs to see beyond the present and tomorrow. He needs to see years and decades ahead. When I received your invitation to share my ideas with you, I was touched by the logo on the stationery, which was a tree. Yes. That tree is similar to the logo of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. It is a symbol of a baobab tree, or a resilient tree with deep roots. The baobab tree symbolizes the spirit of our reverence for those we honor, like we did this morning when we honored this land upon which we sit. It is considered to be a sacred tree of knowledge and life, and African people alternatively know it as mother. Often mistaken for dead, this fascinating tree, whose lifespans have been recorded from 1,000 to 4,000 years, is much alive and full of resources. Peoples come from all over to the baobab tree to pray, to gather honey, to pick fruit, and to find medicinal herbs. The tree nourishes many small and large animals of the savanna. And even in times of drought, the baobab tree has proven to be a source of water. But the urgency of now is reflected in the fact that this past year, several African baobab trees began to die after thousands of years of life. So I can only say to you, as wounded healers and warriors, watch for the signs. Stay on your post, and most of all, do the self-care necessary to give, but also to receive. And let us together share in this battle against historical trauma and political terrorism and the spiritual forces of evil from systems of powers and principalities. God bless you all. Wakanda forever.